Radio Mano Papachango.
Good morning, Chris. This is Brian. I'm coming to you from the Bolivian Amazon, where I'm here with my girlfriend and my sister and our environmental nonprofit that I recently started up. This is our first international project where we're building a research station and doing a tree planting program deep in the Aquacana Reserve to help protect and strengthen this part of the world. I wanted to share with you my experience. I'm coming out of an Ayahuasca ceremony, one of 5, and the night before our Aya ceremony, our shaman gave us some tobacco, and he instructed us to remember our dreams and take our dream of that night into our first Aya ceremony. And I couldn't remember anything from the dream, but I remembered that you were in it. And when I woke up, that was the only thing. So I've been traveling the world for a number of years now, and I've always wanted to do one of these recordings for the podcast. And I felt like this was the perfect one. So I want to say thank you to everything that you're doing. I want to say thank you to all your listeners. I have a lot of love for all of humanity right now, and I appreciate your insight into the human psyche and your insight into the evolution of the species. So thank you very much. I love you all, and keep doing what you're doing, man.
God damn, Brian, thank you for that. I'm honored to be in your dream, especially a tobacco, ayahuasca, Amazon jungle dream. Yeah, that's amazing. What an honor. This episode is an interesting one. This guy's name is Dave Pell. Strangely, I seem to be the only person who didn't know who Dave Pell was, but he's got a newsletter that everybody reads. It's crazy. If you go to NextDraft.com, you'll see a bunch about the newsletter. He basically reads, 50, 60, 70 websites every day, and he sort of gleans what he thinks are the most important and interesting stories, and he does it with great intelligence and a very sharp sense of humor, and that's what I really appreciate about it. I've been reading it since I found out about it a month or so ago, and it's become my essential go-to thing that comes into my inbox every morning. And I feel like we're in this time where we need to be so careful about our information diet. There's so much crap that we're being fed. And so somebody who performs a service like this and does it with a sense of humor and discernment is really doing something special. He's got a book coming out about the crazy year that we lived last year called Please Scream Inside Your Heart. I think we'll look back on 2020 as a year in which history began a sharp pivot. I'm not sure exactly what we're pivoting toward. You know, when we're in the midst of a revolution, we rarely know that we're in the midst of a revolution or what we're revolving toward, but clearly something is afoot. Some crazy shit is happening. The Washington Post just came out with a in-depth analysis of the January 6th insurrection, And it's pretty devastating. And I keep, and meanwhile, what is it called? The latest get together of world leaders talking about, the empty promises they're making about environmental change is underway. And I think it's in Scotland this time. I read this morning that 400 private jets flew into that meeting to talk about the evils of unrestrained capitalist energy, carbon footprint growth. Yeah, good luck with that, guys. I keep finding myself in this strange place where I'm wishing things were worse so that they could start getting better. It's a weird place to be, but I feel like intellectually it's and emotionally it's where I find myself so often. Stephen Donzinger, who was on the podcast a couple of months ago, you may remember him. He defended indigenous people in the Amazon against oil companies, won a huge judgment, billions of dollars against the oil companies, and instead of paying it, they hired teams of lawyers and private investigators and every kind of dirty trick artist they could find to discredit Stephen, to undermine the prosecution, and to scare anyone who may think about doing something similar in the future. Stephen's been under house arrest for, I think, almost 3 years. And interestingly, the Justice Department declined to prosecute him. So what happened was they came up with these charges. They claimed that he had ghost-written someone's testimony, and they came up with all these things. And then they said, okay, we need your computer and your phone in order to investigate this. And he said, no, I'm a fucking lawyer. I can't give you my phone and my computer because that contains private, protected communications with my clients. Pretty basic legal shit. The Justice Department said, well, we're not going to prosecute this. This is stupid. And so Chevron hired a legal firm to prosecute Stephen. I didn't even know this was fucking possible. I thought it was the government versus whoever committed a crime, allegedly. But apparently, this is the first corporate prosecution ever. So a company can hire a fucking private law firm to prosecute you for something, even if the government doesn't want to be involved. What the fuck is that? Anyway, this Judge Preska, who has worked with Chevron in the past, sentenced Stephen to 6 months in prison. Prison for contempt of court. No lawyer has ever been sentenced to prison for contempt of court, much less 3 years of house arrest. But in his last email before he drove himself to prison, supposedly he's a flight risk, this guy, this Harvard-trained lawyer with a family. He's a flight risk. They're afraid he's going to fly off and live in the Amazon, I guess, for the rest of his life or something to avoid prosecution. So he has to go to prison. So he got in a car, drove himself to prison, this flight risk. And in his last email, before he checked in, he framed this as the beginning of things getting better. That for the first time in 3 years, he can go to bed at night without what are they called? The fucking ankle bracelet. No, it's a bed in prison, but hey, at least he doesn't have the ankle bracelet. And I don't know. Anyway, the point is things need to get bad, really bad, before they start getting better. Alcoholics always talk about how you have to hit rock bottom. So somebody's got a drinking problem or a drug problem or any other kind of addiction that they know in their heart is leading them to a bad place. I imagine there's some sort of eagerness to make it worse so that you'll hit rock bottom. If you're on your way down, if you're on your way to rock bottom and you want to get better, then I guess you want to accelerate your descent so that you can start bouncing back as soon as possible. Does that make sense? It's a strange way to think about self-destructiveness as the first step towards self-preservation. But I kind of feel like that's where we are in the world right now. Like, we know this shit isn't working. We know it's getting worse. We know it's going to get worse until it hits a point where we either drink ourselves to death with oil, or it gets so bad that we give it up. But we're not going to give it up by a bunch of fucking private jets, 400 private jets flying into some resort in Scotland, and a bunch of rich motherfuckers talking about pledges they're going to make to be carbon neutral by 2040. Fuck that. Fuck their pledges. We know what their pledges are worth. No, it's going to start to get better when Washington, D.C. is 6 feet underwater, when Wall Street is flooded, when the billionaires at Morgan Stanley can't get in the elevators because the machines have all burned out because of all the water in the basement. It's going to start to get better when Miami is underwater. Maybe. But I don't see how it's going to get better before then. Anyway, Dave Pell, please scream inside your heart. He's interesting. He's funny. He's smart as fuck. I hope you enjoy this episode. I was looking for a song to play that had political relevance, and I was just sort of rummaging around in my song files. I'm old school. I don't do Spotify. I did it for a while, and I mean, I got all pissed off because it's like I'm paying money to listen to my own music, and the fucking Spotify thing can't even like do a random shuffle properly. It keeps playing the same 100 songs over and over, even though I uploaded like 5,000 songs or something. So I just got like old grumpy man on that shit and canceled it. So now I'm back to my old style, and I prefer to pay the artists for their fucking music. I know Spotify's ripping them off. So when I hear something new that I like, I just go into iTunes and buy it. Old school, $1.29 a song. Yeah. Anyway, I was looking for stuff to, something to play here that was relevant, and I came up with a few interesting options. There are a lot of political songs, obviously. Not as many as I would think, not as many new. I would think, you know, things are as crazy right now or crazier than they were in the mid-'60s. Where's all the political songs? Where's the Dylan? Where's the Beatles? Where's the Gimme Shelter? Where is that shit? I don't know. It seems like there was a sort of uptick in political messaging in the world of hip hop and rap, but that's, you know, sort of faded out into the, you know, normal I love money, I drink Cristal bullshit. But in the early days of hip hop, it was very political, you know, NWA and fuck the police. And anyway, this song for me is one of the most deeply political songs I know. It strangely reminds me of Alaska because I had this song on a cassette tape that I listened to in my Walkman when I was hitchhiking to Alaska in 1983-4. So I guess that's when it came out, or maybe a year or two before then. It's called The Message. and it's by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, and it's talking about trying to live a life that's just fucking unsustainable. Here we are. Thanks for listening to another commercial-free episode of Tangentially Speaking. Dave Pell, check him out, and I will be back with you soon. Bye. All right. I'm here with Dave Pell. Thank you, Dave. You're in Marin County, is that right?
Yeah, I'm in Sausalito.
Sausalito. Sweet. That's nice. The book is called Please Scream Inside Your Heart. Is this your first book?
Yeah, this is my first book. I've been actually meaning to write a book for about 30 years or so. But usually late at night at about 2 a.m, I come up with an idea over the last few decades, and the next morning I tell my wife what the idea was, and she sort of shakes her head and goes, "Nope, that's not it. You're not the right person to write that book." And during 2020, during the pandemic, when all the news was becoming so overwhelming and almost impossible to follow, and yet so meaningful for, as we can see, 2021 and beyond, I sort of came up with this idea of writing a book that sort of captured 2020 in a time capsule and used the sort of style I've been working on for about 20 years as a newsletter writer covering the news. And so this time I actually woke her up in bed and said, "I think I've got it." And she looked at me with a pretty upset face because of waking her and knowing that it would probably not be good. But she said, "Okay, that's it." And the next day I just started writing.
Oh, wow. Great. Well, I hope the book gets the kind of reception that makes your wife wish she had given you the go-ahead years earlier.
No, she was right in those years earlier, so she's rooting for a good reception for sure. No, she was right, and she was also my best editor. So yeah.
You know, I think books are collaborative efforts. Even if only one person's name appears on the cover, there's always somebody that has your back. Otherwise, nobody's going to have the time or energy or self-reliance to actually get it done, you know?
Yeah, it's definitely, you need people around because it's such a long project, and it often means you have to be doing your thing while your family is doing their thing.
Exactly.
But it's also good. I'm lucky. I have a lot of friends. Unlucky in a way that a lot of friends I have are incredibly successful authors. So the advice they give me is like, well, first do Anderson Cooper and then Terry Gross and then Howard Stern. And I'm like, all right, what next? But I also have, a lot of people who have given me a ton of feedback about navigating the publishing industry, what to expect from editors, how to get the cover you want, and all these other stuff. So it's nice to sort of have a little crew that you can depend on. And also to be reminded that, especially when you work on the internet your whole life, it sometimes feels like you're sort of screaming into a void. You get emails, but mostly negative, let's be honest. And, you press send like I do on my newsletter, and it just sort of goes out, and then the rest of the day continues. So it's nice to have like a community of people that sort of give a shit about what you're doing, so that they care about this little detail in a paragraph on page 142 that you care about, even if the average person is probably not going to notice it. So that really has been helpful. And I think to the extent that people can build that when they do stuff online, like what you're doing now and what I do with my newsletter, it's really valuable because the internet gave us the ability to sort of be indies and go out there and connect with people on our own terms, which is incredibly powerful. But it does get lonely every now and then. So it's nice to have a few people you can really count on, whether it's a book, whether it's a newsletter, that you can say, hey, what do you think of this? And they're sort of on your side and they're with you every day, sort of like office workers or a team, so it doesn't you don't get bummed out as much, I think, which can happen when you work alone.
Yeah. I mean, do you ever feel like you're going backwards in terms of technology and distribution? You're talking about you hit send and it's out there. You got like 160,000 readers or something, which is a big audience. For a book, that's a huge audience. But you're going back. It's almost like you're going from Spotify to printing vinyl or something. It's like a relic in a way, writing a book.
It's interesting. I actually have seen that trend over my years working on the internet, that there's a lot of people who came up through the internet that wish they could do some print stuff. And there's a lot of people who are pretty well known writing for big news publishers who actually want to go out and do an indie thing. And we're sort of seeing that with Substack. There's obviously a lot of other factors, financial included, that are driving that. But no, every time I go into a bookstore, I've always wished that I could see a book of mine in there, and that I thought I had that in me. The hard part now is to sort of say, okay, that was always a goal, and now I'm going to have that goal on November 2nd. So that's totally awesome. But then you think, well, I also want these other 30 things, It's sort of like if you train for a marathon, it's like, well, I didn't hit the time I wanted, but you had been training your whole life saying, if I could just complete a marathon, I'd feel pretty good about myself. But now I did it in 30 minutes too long or whatever. So therefore I don't feel good about myself. So I guess that's part of the process also. But yeah, I've always wanted to be old school. If I could have any job, I would like to be a columnist for a newspaper. I don't know if remember that show, 8 is Enough. The dad on that show. Yeah, the dad on that show was like a columnist in his town. And one day he'd write about like a very important public issue. And the next day he'd write about something that his son Tommy screwed up. I know this is old school, but yeah, that always has been my dream job, actually, just to be like Herb Cain type of character who we used to have out here in the Bay Area.
Just
I remember
Herb
whatever
Cain.
the hell you want to write about. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, I mean, that's kind of what you're doing, right? I mean, there are a lot of people who have newsletters about, here's what happened yesterday. Your style is what sets you apart. So people are reading for your curation abilities, but also you have a very kind of light, quick on your feet writing style that makes it enjoyable to read, even if it's depressing as hell.
Oh, thanks a lot. You just basically enjoyable to read, even though it's depressing as hell, is my brand right there. That's the brand of my newsletter, the brand of my book. It's like a lot of sugar to put the medicine down. But I definitely think of my newsletter as a modern day column when people ask me to describe it. I think if the column were invented today, it would look a lot like NextDraft does, where it's a bunch of individual takes, occasional personal takes are about my personal life, and then a lot of links off to like what's happening on the internet in the world that day by way of full news stories that you can go read. So yeah, I did pattern that style that you're I'm happy that you feel you see in there off of a column and trying to be a columnist. The other really cool thing about the internet, even though these days we talk about the negatives of it so much, rightfully so, I didn't think it would ruin democracy when I first got online, but is that it does allow you to form a product and a output of that product tool, a tool and a product that reflect your skills, really. So like I love counterpunching off of information. So that's why I cover the news. I mean, I'm interested in news. I'm addicted to news, but also this fits perfectly into my sort of particular writing sweet spot, which is counterpunching. I like making jokes. I like playing in a room that the joke is not necessarily expected. It's not like you're a stand-up comedian and everybody's there saying, okay, prove it to me. It's more like a wedding toast where it's like people are expecting the lowest common denominator. They're not necessarily expecting to laugh. So you can hit them with the joke only when you actually have a good joke, as opposed to feeling you need to fill the space. So I was able to take sort of a suite of internet tools and build a product around what I do well, which is otherwise possibly unmarketable pre-internet. Hey, I'm really good at making quick takes and jokes about the news. It's like, great, your family is going to be remarkably entertained for the rest of your life, but otherwise, what are you going to do, So that's been lucky for me. The timing of all this has been really lucky for me.
Do you ever feel like you joke that you didn't know the internet was going to ruin democracy. Do you ever feel like things lined up really well for you personally, but that same configuration is kind of detrimental to most other people? In other words, you have a set of skills that interfaces really well with these technological developments, but the technological developments themselves are corrosive to democracy and the environment and everything else.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I feel that every day, really. I mean, because of the side of democracy I'm on, which I would call pro-democracy, it's a negative. That part of it is a negative for me, too. But on the broader the broader scheme of American society, certainly technology left a lot of people behind. It's expanded the economic divide, which is pretty obviously the number one threat to our democracy, more than Fox News, more than Facebook or whatever else. It's this huge divide and the huge rage that we have towards each other. So I think, like 2020, technology sort of puts a magnifying glass or holds a mirror up to the worst of our flaws. But it also provides these tools to amplify those flaws to the benefit of a very few, whether that's a very few financially that are making money off of the rage, or whether that's a very few politically that are able to establish minority rule, basically, or pass laws that are wildly unpopular among a majority of people. So there's endless downsides to what we've built. And I think it's really important to talk about those downsides, because otherwise we don't fix them. That's the whole point of news, is to, I think, sure, you want to have positive stories, but you also want to show what's broken so that people have an impetus to fix it. But there's also, of course, a lot of great things about the internet, and both were in full display during 2020, which is what made it such an interesting time. It was absolutely imperative. It saved families, kids, social lives, development, school, being able to work, the economy. Imagine all of these things. Imagine quarantine without the internet. It would have been an absolute epic disaster that we can't even imagine. And yet, it was also being used at the exact same time to spread disinformation that made and makes the pandemic last longer. It's used to spread fake news and false information that is negative for democracy and distorts reality. So both of those things were happening at once. It was both mandatory and horrible at the same time.
So how do you distinguish between real news and fake news? I mean, this has to be at the foundation of what you do every day. When you look at, Judith Miller's reporting in the New York Times that led the United States into invading Iraq, for example, right? Like, Washington Post does the same shit. Now, they're not as obvious or consistent as some other, news sources, if we even call them news sources. But how do you know? How do you judge, like this Hunter Biden laptop thing is back in the news again? Is that real or not? I'm having trouble figuring out A, is it real, and B, does it matter?
Yeah, well, I think I can say pretty safely it certainly doesn't matter. Is it real? I think you can sometimes look at the source. I think in some ways there's a false equivalence that we have in the broad question about fake news. There actually isn't sort of one universe that views one version of events and another universe that is experiencing or reviewing another view of those same events. In America's news landscape today, we have a situation where one group is actually trying to do good journalism, and that good journalism can often have mistakes. It can always be criticized. It's absolutely imperative that it gets criticized constantly from observers. But the ultimate effort is actually to work with a set of facts that are agreed upon and visible with our own eyes. Then there's the false equivalence that has been created so effectively by Fox News by calling themselves news And I can go into how the mainstream media allows them to do that with some of their behavior. But where it's very obvious that the content being shared by them is either manufactured or tweaked or invented in order to fool people, trick people, enrage people. The best example you can see of that is their vaccine nonsense during much of 2020. They've sort of shifted a tiny bit lately, but basically they've supported and promoted people like DeSantis who don't want vaccine mandates. They've sort of questioned every quackery question about a vaccine they've put up. They've suggested that mandating vaccines is some form of totalitarianism and it's this democratic plot. And yet, when you see the memos that go out from the Fox News CEO to his own employees, he's got the same mandates. They're all vaccinated. It's entertainment. It's a trick. So I think it's important, at least from my perspective, to differentiate between those two things. One group that is trying to create a false reality intentionally for political or monetary gain. And then the mainstream news, which is attempting to cover things in a pretty straightforward way. But of course, people have their weaknesses. People get stories wrong. And what you want to look for there is when they get the story wrong, do they hold themselves accountable? And are they held accountable by other participants in that media universe where reality is covered?
Well, just to push back a little bit, how do you account for corporate influence? How do you account for the fact that Archer Daniels Midland is, supplying most of the money to keep, the NewsHour on PBS running? How does that affect their coverage of food supply and industrial agriculture and, runoff from pig farms in South Carolina and so on? I mean, there is a bias in mainstream news as well. It's just pro-corporate, pro-status quo, isn't it?
I mean, there's definitely bias in news. There's no doubt about it. My take on this is, though, we have to separate bias from intentionally creating false stories for personal gain. There's a big difference between those two. Do we expect every news site to cover everything the way we want them to? No chance. But I go to 75 or so sites a day that some people would call mainstream news sites. I call them news sites. And they're attempting to tell a real story. Of course, there might be pressures, financial pressures at the corporate level, but in general, those reporters are out there trying to tell the real stories as best they can. And if you cut across all 75 of those and pick the stories that are people mostly agree on, or maybe an outsider, an outlier that seems accurate, that somebody got the better story, I think you're going to get a pretty good idea of what the broad trends are in America. Does that mean you should believe every word that you read, or especially the tone and tenor of every word you believe about something? Definitely not. I mean, I've always said, I used to cover only tech news, and I always said, everybody believes a news story is totally accurate except the people who that story is about, right? Nobody can get your business or your school or whatever in a simple article. Also, there's trends that I call it media momentum. Media momentum just drives a ton of groupthink and a ton of similar takes and a similar focus on similar stories. We saw that bright and clear during the Afghanistan withdrawal. Here was a story that was, I wouldn't say ignored, because the media was covering the story, but it was back page news about what was going on in Afghanistan for the last, except for a few exceptions, for the last 10 to 15 years. Suddenly, when the withdrawal came, that news story was covered in a complete vacuum. Of course, there was going to be a mess when we pulled out of this kind of a war. Of course, there's a chance that people will die when you're doing a withdrawal. It was a tragedy. The 12 Americans who died, and the 170 Afghans who were ignored by American media who died during that suicide bombing. It's, of course, a tragic story. But we had thousands of American service personnel killed in the 20 years before that. And to pretend that that's not part of the broader story is sort of a joke. So that sort of groupthink, and we can see this with, this social media woman who sadly was murdered, and now it's everywhere on the media. Well, we had I think in 2020, there were about 1,000 kids who died of gunshot wounds, kids in America. Like, murder is America's pastime. So how is it that one murder is gaining so much steam in the media? Now, the media will write 42 articles explaining that the reason it's such a huge story is because she was a social media personality. It sort of gathered the momentum that we as viewers of crime shows and crime podcasts are into these days, and it rolled out, the facts of the case roll out in real time, so it's so engrossing. That's true, but that explains why you and I might be into that story. I'm not, but that explains why a lot of people are. But that doesn't explain why mainstream media is covering that story like it's a massive story, when there have probably been 52 murders in the last 3 days of coverage that are equally big news.
How many of those murder victims were cute 22-year-old blondes, though?
Right.
Let's be honest.
No, that's absolutely a factor in it. I'd say there's probably are some that didn't have all these other factors, but there's no doubt that that's a piece of it for sure. But the piece that I think is a broader issue with the news is that, journalists live on social media. They live on Twitter to both gain information and to promote their own work. But it's a very small universe, and you see a ton of articles. I invite your listeners, as they're going through the news one day, just look for how many articles suggest that there's a huge rift in American society, or there's a huge story bubbling up, or there's a major pushback or promotion of some idea. And then as they read further, it's actually that this trend is emerging from Twitter users. And it's a handful of Twitter users that already are on a platform that represent a handful of Americans. So I worry about the trend of news bubbling up from the grassroots of internet users. I'd rather see a situation where, yes, this one murder is being understandably obsessed over by a group of internet users, especially those who followed the person. I didn't follow her, but if somebody that I followed closely on Instagram or whatever was murdered in real time, I'm sure I would be upset and follow that story as well. But I just don't want that to be sucked up to the top of the news when there's a million other stories. So
it's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
As someone who lives in a van about half the year, I think another part of the story is the whole van life thing, right? The nomad land, the prevalence of oh, wait, is it safe to go out and, live this romantic ideal of, nomadic, modern nomadism? Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Listening to you talk, I was thinking about the similarities between journalism and science, and how, there's a lot of corporate manipulation of medical research, particularly, but all kinds of research, and vested interests and bias and the mistakes and all the other factors that you mentioned. But underlying it is the scientific method, is an actual respect for demonstrable, repeatable experimental results. And I think people lose sight of that yes, we can focus on all the mistakes, as we should, and all the distortions and bias, but it's the best we've got, and you may say there is no journalistic objectivity, which I think is probably true, but aspiring to that is pretty much all we have as far as guiding, national dialogue.
Right. And I would just say that the doubt that you rightly connect to how we feel about science, the connection is that there are people sowing that doubt. It's not just that it exists.
Right.
So that's the part that's so disturbing, as hard as it would be to be a journalist during 2020. I can't imagine being a scientist. What a nightmare that you're working day and night to find a cure for something that's threatening humanity. And all of a sudden, halfway through the year, you find that you're being assigned bodyguards because of threats from people. Of course, it's not the majority of people, but I mean, I know people don't usually conflate science and miracles, but we really have experienced a miracle given the history of pandemics in the world, how fast we got a vaccine. What a miracle it was. It took the people at Moderna 3 days from the time they got a sample of the virus from China to create the vaccine that people are now able to put in their arms. I mean, we have to adjust, of course, how fast we can get things to market, but it really was like a miracle. And it was using a scientific technique that most people had written off. It was basically one woman who really pushed this in academia for years and got booted from one school after another because they didn't think she could achieve her goals. So it's sad that when we have these moments that we can't, I call them Bullhorn moments. I was not a fan of George W. Bush, but when the towers got knocked down, we just celebrated the 20th anniversary. So we all saw the videos a million times again, which for better or worse. But, when he had the bullhorn in his arm around the fireman there among the wreckage and said, the people who did this are going to hear from all of us. It was a moment that I felt we're all in this together, not just fighting somebody, but also comforting the people at ground zero and caring about what that must have been like in the common experience of everybody's been on a plane and thought, what if this is the one that goes down, But to be on those planes, what human can't relate to how horrible that would be, right? But that's just gone from our society today, that unity. I don't think we can have a bullhorn moment because we just had something that has killed, 200,000 times more people. I'm doing the math wrong, but 200 times more people than 9/11 or whatever. We're up to 660,000 people. And we still can't come together and have a bullhorn moment and say, this virus is going to fucking hear from us. For some reason, there's some people with a vested interest in saying, no, that's just a liberal idea or whatever, It's just totally crazy that this is political. And of all the things that I find depressing about 2020 and its aftershocks in 2021, that's really that missed opportunity is, besides, of course, the death, that missed opportunity on an idea level is just really depresses me. And it was such a missed opportunity to say, man, we've been so divided for so long about so many petty issues, but here's something we can finally unify and say, hey, man, let's all do this together. Like with the whole mask mandate thing, I've never put on a mask and thought, oh, my rights are being taken away. When I walk down the street or into a supermarket and I see everybody wearing a mask, I feel like uplifting feeling, like this is cool that we're all doing something together. That we're all fighting one fight, If we can get fired up about our favorite baseball or football team, why can't we get fired up about our own team of humans fighting this, thing that is,
Yeah. Yeah. When the mask thing started happening and I talked about it on the podcast, I've been doing this podcast 9 years now. And I have never had blowback like I had when I talked about wearing masks. And the weird thing about it is, I can even respect some people who voted for Trump the first time around, because I think a lot of what you and I are talking about here is there's an inherent corruption within any system, whether it be journalism or science or politics or corporatism or the military or whatever, the Catholic Church. And a lot of that corruption has come to light in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And a lot of people now look at institutions and say, I don't trust them. They're liars. They lied to me about, low fat being better for me. Now, 20, 30 years later, it turns out that research was funded by the fucking Sugar Council, and it was all bullshit, and they knew it was bullshit, and the research showing that it was bullshit was suppressed. There are reasons for people to be suspicious of mainstream information coming at them. I look at people who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, and I have a lot of sympathy. Obama said, change you can believe in, and it turned out to be incremental change at best. And meanwhile, whistleblower prosecutions went up, and, deportations went up, and drone attacks went up. So there's a lot of reason to be very disappointed in these institutions. But man, masks is like, to me, that was just so obvious. The virus is in your saliva droplets. Masks block and greatly reduce the distribution of saliva droplets. So fucking wear a mask, there's no relying on an expert opinion here. This is obvious. But man, I got a lot of blowback. And it's something I wanted to ask you about. On your newsletter, you're both curating and presenting in your unique voice, but also you editorialize. You're pretty open about your perspective and what's true and what's not true and what's bullshit. And it's not just sort of implicit in what you choose to cover. You say it outright. Have you suffered blowback for your opinions on masks or other items?
I mean, definitely everybody on the internet, suffers blowback, and that was only enhanced or increased during the Trump era, when yelling at each other online was sort of a sport that was so popular that even our highest ranking leaders and corporate leaders participated in it. But no, I don't pretend at all to be unbiased. I almost laugh when people say you're supposed to be an unbiased source of news. I mean, my newsletter has my head on it and my name on it. So it's not at all unbiased. But it is biased towards truth, ultimately, and against lies. What you were saying about Trump, I totally relate to that. I mean, I feel very strongly that in order for Trump to have tapped into a certain anger, there's no doubt that he also tapped into latent racism and allowed it to become overt racism. That's been clear from the birther movement that got him on the map, all the way through the insurrection where people had Confederate flags and, Nazi emblems and were calling Capitol Police the N-word, right? So I don't want to discount that, but there's also anger, disillusion, suffering. And I understand that anger. I mean, if I lived along I-95 where the opioid crisis was at its worst and it was completely ignored, basically, by the government for years, and then they finally decide to shut down all the pill mills, but with no support for the people who are now addicted, and El Chapo just goes, hey, great, marijuana's going out of business. I got a new product to sell. And that's just sort of allowed to happen, and basically is not a huge discussion at the federal level. It was a huge story, to credit media where they deserve credit, but it wasn't a huge political issue. I can understand that anger. If I'm working in a coal, in the coal industry, and my grandfather died of black lung and my dad has black lung, and I'm working in it, and I've been told my whole life, hey, yes, this is a risky business and we shave a few years off our lives, but we are powering America. We make it so our industry can go and our military can go. And what you're doing is a laudable thing. And then all of a sudden you have a few people who make $1 billion out of nowhere on some app. They're getting into alternative energies and they're telling you how coal is evil and the coal industry is terrible. I understand the rage there. Not that I'm pro coal. I want us to move, but let's move with the people who work in those industries and get them out of the mines and get them safer, but not belittle them, And I can see when I go on television that Fargo is basically our our perception of how a lot of people in rural areas live, you know, and we're so separated that it's easy for us to caricaturize each other, you know. So I understand the rage that people feel, but I definitely don't understand how the expression of that rage, like why was that rage expressed in a person who's obviously a crook, a liar, a con artist? That part is the part that is more perplexing to me. I mean, I've come to understand it after writing about it and studying it and looking at the psychology of it. But that's the only, I've never questioned. I feel like our political relationship should be a lot like our, almost like a marriage, where you can have a conversation with somebody about their anger, but you can't say they're wrong to be angry, right? If you tell your wife, hey, your anger is not justified, you know, you're going to get punched in the face, rightfully so. So I don't want to tell anybody in America that their anger or their disillusion or their depression or their just being fed up with things. I think most of it's driven by the economic divide and the regional divides, which are so damaging. But yeah, I don't tell people they shouldn't be angry. I get that. But what I don't get is why they picked somebody who wouldn't help that cause even a tiny bit. You know, none of those policies were helping anybody. Coal didn't do better under Trump. Poor people did worse under Trump. You know, it's guys like me. I invest in internet startups. It's guys like me who did well under Trump financially. You know, not psychically, but financially. So that part was the bummer.
Yeah, I think people aren't really looking at policies. I think they're just looking at the show. Yeah. And the show is that Trump, you know, said, fuck you to the system. You know, you're all corrupt. You know, oh, Putin kills people. Well, we kill people too. You know, like that's true, right? I mean, he says things that people were like, wow, he's a liar. But sometimes he says a truth that I've never heard anyone else say. And it gets, you know, I think it's the same reason Joe Rogan's so popular, right? He's a loose cannon. He'll say whatever comes into his head, and people are dying for that, for this unfiltered, unfocused grouped, not careful utterance.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I see why a guy like Joe Rogan might be popular. The scary part is that it jumped into actual world leadership, right? Like when Trump was, I'm a huge Howard Stern fan. And when Trump used to be a guest on his show, you know, I mean, I thought he was an asshole, obviously, but he was, you know, no doubt about it, one of the best guests, you know, was what he said about Rosie O'Donnell nice? Was when he rated women nice? No, of course not. You know, it was especially by our current standards totally unacceptable, and by our even then probably unacceptable. But was he an entertaining guest? You know, because he'd be willing to do that and didn't care if people said, hey, you broke a rule or whatever. Absolutely. You know, he is an incredible candidate for court jester. You know, he would have been America's greatest court jester. He just was not a candidate to be a president. You know, he is and was deeply mentally ill. I mean, the most interesting stuff you can read on Trump is go back and read, I think 27 psychologists wrote a book about all the things they said were coming in 2016. It was published related to Trump's symptomology. And it's like, absolutely, all of it came true, you know? You know, and my dad, who was a Holocaust survivor and not a raging liberal by any standards, probably a Republican for most of his life, you know, he predicted almost everything that took place right up until Trump wouldn't leave office and tried to overturn the election. You know, he was predicting it all throughout 2020. You know, people who had seen authoritarianism before knew what they were seeing with Trump. You know, yeah, it was funny. That's why I think he should be a court jester. It was all hilarious. You know, we had more fun than any of us have ever had on the internet during the Trump era, just going off, you know, and society is, I think, starving for stories that we can share and all be talking about the same thing at the same time. You know, the internet has really divided us into silos. You look at the Emmys this week, you know, every show that wins is basically a show you have to pay for, And the biggest winner, or one of the biggest winners, Ted Lasso, you have to have Apple TV specifically for it. So, you got to have some decent amount of extra income that you can spend on entertainment to even have seen these shows. Forget about whether you like them or not. We're divided everywhere. We're divided in what media we watch. We're divided in what news we read. We're divided geographically. We're divided on our ideas. But here came Trump, and as bad as it felt, there was something about having a show that we all knew every character. We knew every move. You could go up to anybody on the street, regardless of their political background, and strike up a conversation about what happened in the last 5 hours of the Trump story, and they would know exactly what you were talking about. So
Right.
there was this attraction to it, and I can see why people probably have some withdrawals from that. For some of us, it might have been so psychically damaging that this was happening to our country that we're would have given anything to end it, but we still watched it.
And it was very good for media, right? I mean, eyeballs on media increased dramatically during the Trump era, and now they're falling off pretty dramatically from what I've read.
Yeah.
Do you think?
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, this leads into the next thing I wanted to ask you about. Do you think America is ungovernable?
I mean, that's a big question, I guess. I think that a lot of the anger divides and all that we've seen, especially, sort of bubble up in its earthquake of 2020, were there all along. Let me give you an example of the way I think about it. I was talking to my publisher and my PR team, right? And they were saying, about if book tours can happen, which they probably won't be able to, but if they can, we probably want to focus our media on blue states and our book tours on blue states, right? And I said, most states are like, there's some that are huge advantage to one side or the other, but most states it's like a couple of percent, 3-4%. It's enough to secure a Senate seat, of course, but there's like tons of people of all political persuasions in all states, and not also. I want my book to be read by people who don't share my political persuasion, but I think it's governable, but it's this little pieces at the edge that just slipped over the edge. I think the stuff that bubbled over from 2016 and the rage that exploded due to a bunch of factors. It wasn't just Trump. I really do think it's this economic divide and the way we're treated each other. And really the geographic divide, which is related to the economic divide, is such a huge factor. America will be much more governable when we just talk to each other instead of yelling at caricatures of each other. Somehow we have to get back to actually interacting with each other. Like I've never hated anybody in real life as much as I hate the caricature of a Trump voter. And I'm 100% sure that in most cases, if I was hanging out with that person, which of course I have, whether I'm knowing it or not, the things that bind us are probably much bigger than the things that don't. And we can certainly find things that we both care about that we can talk about in common. I coached a little league team with a guy who's definitely would be a Trump voter. He was a sheriff. He felt that he saw a side of, sort of wealthy Marin County where I live that the average citizen didn't see and didn't understand, and was way too liberal and weak on crime and all that stuff. And hey, I can relate to how he feels. He's spending his nights risking his life, and I'm spending my life watching, girls on HBO. I get it. He's going to have a different view than I have, and he feels differently about guns than I do. But we both care deeply about winning the goddamn Little League game that we were coaching, and our hate for the other coaches that would taunt us or, do weird things, or parents that would criticize us or whatever, the normal things that irritate us in life was 1,000 times stronger than this, and frankly, I appreciated the fact that no other coach and no parent would ever really get in our faces because everybody knew my co-coach was like armed to the teeth, It's like, come on, bring it on, dude. So, I mean, we joked about our differences. That's another thing that's just gone, especially this is on the liberal side. You can't joke about differences. You can't say, okay, I'm a little crazy too. You know what I mean? I think that's why you see today, my kids' generation, 13 to 15, they just can't get enough of The Office. They can't get enough of Modern Family. Not that these shows were like terrible. They were satires, especially The Office. Michael Scott was the butt of the joke. He was like Archie Bunker. The fact that he thought these things that were, either borderline racist or gender, stereotyping, or saying that's what she said, like you brought up my riff on that at the beginning. That was the point, was that he was a joke, and that's what made it funny. Could that show come out today, or could Modern Family? My wife is Samoan, my kids are Samoan. In our extended family, we have, a black preacher, a couple of Muslims, some same gender couples, you name it. We have the kaleidoscope of America. And when we're together, we're joke about every kind of offensive thing you can think of with each other, much like the cast of Modern Family did. I'm not saying that the benefits of stopping some of that kind of talk don't outweigh, the negatives. It's great that we're being more sensitive about all those issues, but I worry that it also extends to our political relationship with each other. We're so angry and so sensitive. There's a chance, the other guy has a point, and there's a chance that in one or two areas I'm sort of a dick, and that happens when you interact in person. But those in-person interactions, I mentioned Little League. And when I was a kid, everybody in our extended town was on the same teams, So you interacted all the time with people, regardless of their job or their socioeconomic status, A ton of kids, like on my football team, their dads worked at San Quentin. So we'd literally sometimes have a party at somebody's house behind the first gate where the dad lived, because he was a guard or whatever. Today, I don't think those exchanges happen as much. There's, if you're decent at a sport, you pay a few grand if you have the money, and your kid's on the travel ball team. Every area where we could connect, we stopped connecting, If you have a certain amount of money, you go to the dollar store. If you have a little more money, you go to Target. If you have something in between, you go to Walmart. If you don't want to interact at all, you just order from Amazon and wait by your house. But the interactions are gone. And when you have those interactions gone, that vacuum creates a place where people can create characterizations of you that are false. So the thing that the average Trump voter would despise about me, I'm sure is as false as the things that I despise most about them. But if we just got together, it'd be like, okay, I don't agree with this guy about that. I mean, I don't agree. Friends don't agree with each other. You know what I mean? It's the way it is. We talk behind each other's backs and give each other shit, but that's a whole different thing from creating these characters. I mean, I have a theory that is pretty far from, Bay Area Little Leagues, but both of my parents were Holocaust survivors. And in the early days when they would try to message how terrible the Jews were, there was this one factor that made it difficult to get the message through, although it obviously got through to plenty of people, which was your neighbor might have been a Jew or your coworker might have been a Jew. So you're like, yeah, you're saying all these things about them, but yet this guy I know and have interacted with for the last 20 years and eats dinner at my house doesn't share the characteristics that you're describing. So, ghettoization of the Jews, as World War II picked up, was like a huge messaging move in addition to a huge physical and terrible, of course, move. Once they were out of sight and out of mind, now it becomes much easier to message whatever you want about them and make people not feel bad about what was happening to them. So I feel like I'm not comparing modern day America to the Holocaust in any way, but I do think this separation is one of the most dangerous things happening in America today.
Yeah, it's almost like single crop agriculture invites pestilence in a way that mixed forest doesn't, right? When everything's the same, something bad, whether it's a fungus or a bad idea about others, can spread unopposed very quickly.
Yeah, like COVID.
What you were talking, I was thinking, you're talking about humor and how humor has been, or any kind of risque humor anyways, being pushed out of the mainstream media. I was thinking about the movie Tropic Thunder. Have you ever seen that?
Yeah.
Talk about a movie that couldn't be made today. And that's not from the 70s. That's, 15, 20 years. But just all the off colors, it's maybe the wrong word, because there's Robert Downey Jr. in blackface and just like the crazy things that they did in that movie. And, Tom Cruise and, Matthew McConaughey, all these major stars, risked their careers to be in that movie. But then that led me to thinking about Vietnam and how the veterans of Vietnam are old and or dying now, right? The guys who came back from that. And that was really the last time that the kind of social mixing that you're talking about probably happened in American society, was the draft in the Vietnam War. Since then, it's all volunteer. So it's all poor guys, who don't have other options from, bumfuck Texas. That's all they got, right? Or get a job at the dollar store. So that kind of mixing, that kind of like, wait a minute, I know, like I served in a platoon with black dudes from the inner city and they were good guys and they saved my life, like that kind of interaction that you're talking about probably hasn't happened since 1969, 70, 71, somewhere in there.
Yeah, I mean, I push back a little bit on what type of people join the military, and that it's not, some of our best and brightest, obviously, and some of my really good friends are, could have any job at any Silicon Valley firm and be, making millions a year, but choose to sacrifice for America. And I'm really moved by people who do that. But certainly in the Vietnam War, where it was a war that a lot of people didn't understand, and, we're only drafting, we were drafting even then a certain segment of America. And that's what I even when I look at the anti-war movement, which I think if somebody said, okay, today you're a liberal, so you'd be part of that, I mean, it really kicked up big time once you could be drafted even if you were in or had gone to college. That's when it really went crazy, Before that, it was sort of an other story. So yeah, the more we can not do that, the more we can try to understand. I mean, I admit that I probably would have a similar description of the average person who had to get drafted or had to go to the military because it was their last option. Had I not known these guys that I've met in the last few years that are either were Navy SEALs or work at the Pentagon or whatever, and their sacrifice and love of America, which I have also, but their sacrifice and what I know it does to their families and the pressures to say, their wives know that if they quit tomorrow, they could be in a much bigger house and their kids could be going to private schools. I mean, these guys are all stars that are in high demand, I'm also inspired by that, but that's another thing that it was helpful for me to know and interact with people with a different background from mine to understand what made them tick, and then to have not only increased respect for them, but also to find this commonality with them, that I'm not just impressed or thankful for their sacrifice. I'm like moved by it because I feel that way about America also.
So you think America is still a force for good in the world, and that these SEALs who are deploying to Yemen and Somalia are having a positive impact on those societies?
Oh, no, it's hard to say that somebody deploying someplace is having a positive impact, especially when we've seen what happened in Afghanistan. But I think that those people that are doing that are making sacrifices. I think the SEALs and former service members who self-deployed to Afghanistan during the withdrawal and rescued families and risked their lives for those families that had helped them, I think they're a force for good. Do we always put our best foot forward in the world? Hell no. Of course I'm a critic of America, but I prefer it to the alternative, definitely. Although the idea of living in a country that was really separate from international spats and wars and crises, which does sound pretty cool after the last few years, Yeah,
I lived in Spain for 20 years. So my take on America is in many ways that of a foreigner, even though I was born and raised in the U.S., but I've been out of the country most of my adult life. And yeah, it is. I mean, I'm in Guatemala right now as we speak, in fact. Nice. Yeah, it's confusing. You posted something, and this is tangentially related. You said that the Democrats reminded you of Cal football, where you expect to lose, but you enjoy watching the game anyway.
I watched the game with hope. I watched the game hopefully. I didn't say enjoy. I've never enjoyed either.
To me, I've always thought of the Democrats as the Washington Generals. Their job is to make it seem like a game against the Globetrotters, but they're not supposed to win, because what you've got is corporate control, obviously, and corporate control hidden a little bit. And I think I'm a little more cynical about American politics than you are. To me, it just looks like it's supposed to seem like there's a chance. And at the last minute, it all falls apart pretty much every time.
Yeah, I'm just to correct one thing. I'm deeply cynical about American politics. I feel a love for America and Americans. I don't feel a love for our political system or, for example, I never watch any of the Sunday morning shows when politicians go on and talk, That said, I know a few politicians who are legitimately working in the business because they want to do good for people. Of course, you have to have a little narcissism and want to be famous and want to be known. That goes along with what you and I are doing right now also, right? Who the hell would be interested in what we have to say? We have to believe that they are, otherwise we wouldn't be out here every day, right? So politicians have that too, probably more so in this age of social media. But some of them do good stuff. But yeah, there's no doubt the corporate influence and phoniness, really, when it comes to politics, is on full display every day for anybody who wants to look at it. I think that stuff is covered a lot by the media if you want to look for it. We know that because people are digging those stories up, and whether it's indies like Judd Legume, who has a good newsletter who really digs in, you see people that are saying all the right things about Black Lives Matter, but they're giving money to politicians who are, posing with Confederate flags. It's a problem. Right. You can see, it's a systemic problem, really, as opposed to people being evil necessarily. We have a system where you lobby for stuff, Look, before I started doing podcasts and interviews for my book, I got in a room with a bunch of PR people and said, okay, what's our best hook? What's our best targets to go after to move the most product, right? That's like everything you see on the news, or a lot of it, everything somebody says on the news goes through a similar filter. and politics even more so. Yeah. But yeah, I'm definitely cynical and depressed endlessly about American politics. I don't think that the Harlem Globetrotters would want to be aligned with the GOP in your analogy. That's the one thing. I think they'd be pretty pissed about that.
Fair point. Fair point. Yeah, definitely. You and I have a lot of things in common here. My last book is called Civilized to Death. Came out 2 years ago. And Simon and Schuster. And it was hard because my writing style, I try to be amusing. My feeling about writing is like, I want to be that professor you had in high school or college who you enjoyed going to class, even though it was hard, and you learned things while you were laughing. And, it's definitely an entertainment component to writing the way I do it, and obviously the way you do it. But it's hard when what you're conveying is difficult material. I mean, my book is arguing that civilization has been a colossal mistake for our species. That's a pretty hard argument to make amusing, So it was a hard book for me to write.
Yeah.
Did you find that when you were writing, like you're trying to be funny and you're trying to keep it light in a way, but the material itself is dragging you to the bottom of the ocean?
I would have felt that way if that wasn't what I had to practice doing for 4 years up until I started writing the book. And the truth is, I talk a lot about it in my book. There were things that were, aside from me trying to make them funny, there were things that happened in 2020 that were undeniably and ridiculously hilarious, I mean, Donald Trump's handling of COVID, was like a medical whoopee cushion, I mean, he said to put, disinfectant in your veins, I mean, I didn't write that joke. Yeah, he wrote that joke. Yeah. I didn't write it. Rudy giving his press conference out in front of a landscaping company. I didn't write the joke. He wrote the joke, But so I think there's two types of humor. There's one that's certainly in my book, the hilarity and craziness of the year. And you had to just laugh, I mean, us running out of toilet paper, it's my wife had just signed up for Amazon a month before monthly toilet paper deliveries. And she forgot she did it because this was pre-pandemic, and it came like in the first month of the pandemic, and we had like 28 rolls, and we're like going to families' houses and leaving them on the doorstep with their rubber gloves. And it was like we were fucking conquering heroes, So there was a lot of humor and funniness to it, and things that were ridiculous or painful, we tried to make funny because that's human nature, and everybody wants to go viral, right? So you want to have the best Trump joke, just like you want to have the best joke about the Super Bowl halftime show or whatever it is, because everybody's talking about the same thing at the same time. So if you have personalities like ours, you want to make the best joke or make the most insightful comment or whatever. But there is a danger to that type of laughter, especially when it comes to big time government affairs. I'll never forget in 2016, I think it was, maybe a little later, my dad, who, as I said, survived the Holocaust and was like only guy in his town to survive, joined the partisans and like blew up trains for like 4 years and came to America and made it big, total self-made man, He said very early on, he said, David, a lot of people laughed at Hitler when I was a kid, and that really made me think, like this laughter is sort of a salve for some things, but it can distract you from how incredibly serious things are. And the other piece of it is that we really see during the COVID thing, which is the tragic part of all this, that this sort of laughable era coincided with this deadly virus, is that the exact same stuff that you and I were laughing at, other people took so seriously that they were willing to risk their lives and actually die for. We got tons of reports. We still do, but certainly during 2020, there were endless reports of people who were being intubated and still insisting this is a Democratic hoax. I'm not really sick, or I'm sick from something else, or you infected me, to the doctor, So that's how seriously. So that's really one thing I didn't think of living 2020 and writing about it in real time that I really thought deeply about. Well, I pulled back and was writing the book about all these ridiculous moments that, wow, what could have been more ridiculous than Rudy Giuliani in front of Four Seasons Landscaping at the very moment the election was decided by the three major networks? Nothing. It was the most absurd, crazy thing. Four Seasons Total Landscaping sold a zillion T-shirts, It was just unbelievable. But yet the arguments that Rudy Giuliani were making on that day still are poisoning American politics. So who's having the last laugh here? That's what I really worry about. So I really thought a lot about humor as it relates to this kind of slide towards authoritarianism, which is, people might think that sounds extreme, but that is what happened, and that is what's happening now, 100%. This is exactly how it works. These pages are being taken right out of authoritarian handbooks. It's so perfect. It's so obvious. And it's so effective, as it has been elsewhere, The other thing my dad said that makes me think of this is, one day we were going to lunch, and this was probably the last week before we all got quarantined, and he was complaining that people weren't out in the streets, how can they take this nonsense, And I said, well, I think people that are in my generation and younger in America, and just in America in general, just think well, this is crazy, this is dangerous, but it can't happen here, And he just stopped in his tracks. We were walking through the restaurant, and he looked at me and said, you think when I was a kid, we thought that it could happen there? And I really thought, damn, this is not a joke. Journalists like Ann Applebaum, who have seen this before and were warning us about it, and, hundreds of other journalists that were warning us about it. It wasn't a joke. It's not a joke now either. It's very serious business. It did happen here, and it is happening here, and it's pretty scary. And I think people need to wake up. It's not just a political fight. It's just more of an ethical and community fight. It's to take back the messaging away from self-interested politicians. I always think the broadband is the greatest story people can use to come together. Broadband is this thing that we should all by now in America have high-speed bandwidth in our homes. And we saw during the pandemic, people had been warning about that for years, And during the pandemic, rural students got totally slammed because they didn't have high-speed internet during the pandemic. And inner city kids who didn't have computers even in some cases, and certainly didn't have access to high-speed bandwidth, also got slammed. Well, if those two groups came together, it would create an absolutely unstoppable political force in America, and we'd have broadband. You couldn't defeat that force. They actually are aligned, Yeah. Economically, people who think they hate each other are actually remarkably aligned. But there's to your point about corporate control, it's all economic politically. And I'd say it has to do with certain people more about getting voted or elected with a minority of supporters, but it relates to that economic divide, that the same people are getting screwed over by dividing us. So, yeah. I wish somebody would have the guts to say that about broadband and see if people don't come together.
Yeah, broadband and universal health care and, child care. I mean, all those things that appeal to, poor whites, blacks, immigrants. They're all divided against each other. They're all in the same voting block if they would realize it. But of course, a lot of people are working very hard to convince them they're not. Let me just end by asking you what I thought it would be the first question, which is to tell the story about the origins of your strange title, Please Scream Inside Your Heart.
Sure. It was about, I think, July of 2020 when there was a pretty famous amusement park called Fuji Q Highland in the shadow of Mount Fuji that had reopened, and people there were, of course, wearing masks. I don't know if you've been to Japan, but even before the pandemic, a ton of people, if you're on the subway or walking down the street, wore masks because of the bird flu. And frankly, it makes sense to wear it even during cold and flu season here, as we've seen. But if we think we get hate now, let's just bring that up. But anyway, so people were wearing their masks with no problem at the Fuji Q amusement park, but they were also screaming on the roller coasters. And so the executives there were worried about that and the health folks in Tokyo. So they put up signs and made a rule that you were allowed to ride but not allowed to yell on the rides. So it sort of became a mini meme or joke in Japanese media that it was impossible, obviously, to not scream, especially on this one ride. I think it was called the Fujiyama roller coaster. So the executives at the park had two of their top employees dressed in suit and tie and with a webcam facing them ride the roller coaster in complete stoic silence without a hair out of place. And they rode it without moving their lips at all. And at the end, I guess their lips were covered by a mask, but they didn't scream. And at the end of the ride, a message came up and said, "Please scream inside your heart." And that became a sort of one of a billion memes that went crazy, and people made T-shirts and all that, and it was everywhere for a day or two and then disappeared. But I just thought it was sort of an idea that connected a lot of things in terms of the humor of the year, the craziness of the year, the impossibility of what we were being asked to do, and also just the rage that all of us felt sort of locked in our houses, unable to really let out. So that was sort of the idea of the book is, you held it in long enough. So come on this ride with me. The book sort of follows a roller coaster ride theme actually throughout the book. So each chapter has a title that is part of a roller coaster ride. And I try to make it really fast also. And, probably equally scary and anxiety-inducing as the average roller coaster also. So I thought this would be a good way to let people let the scream out.
Right. Right. Is there a subtitle?
The subtitle is Breaking News and Nervous Breakdowns in the Year That Wouldn't End.
So right.
It's a lot about the news. A lot of the stuff we've discussed today is touched upon critiques of mainstream media as well, and sort of a story of how I became a news addict based on my relationship growing up with my parents, and how everybody's news addiction got out of hand in 2020, which it really did. Even people who weren't into the news that I know couldn't stop talking about it. It was actually ruining their lives in some ways. But I sort of explain how we got there in terms of what the media was doing and what technologies were emerging, and how we ended up with this perfect storm in 2020.
Where did your dad grow up?
My dad grew up in a little town called Biała Podlaska in Poland.
In Poland?
Yeah.
Okay.
But then
I was wondering.
Yeah, it moved a lot after that. Once the war started, he was on the move. Right. But he has a book also that's called Taking Risks. That's actually an amazing. There's a ton about my dad in the book. And he has a book about his life called Taking Risks. He had quite an amazing cinematic life that was almost impossible to believe as you're reading it. And it's taught at a few universities. But one of my colleagues, I guess I would say, Dahlia Lithwick, who writes for Slate, she blurbed my book, and she sort of described what it was about and why it was important. And then in the end, she said it's also a love letter to his own dad, and people who know democracy is something you have to fight for, not just accept or enjoy. And her line was probably better than any line I wrote in my own book, because it really is a lot about that. It's hard to sort of put that all on the book cover, but it's just as much about my parents and their take on what happened in 2020 from their perspective, So that's the part that's most important to me, actually.
Oh, good. Yeah. I didn't want to just come out and say it and put you in a bad spot, but I was hoping that you told their story in the book, because just the little references you've made to them sound really interesting and important.
Yeah, I do in my newsletter also. I know you're a new subscriber, but other people certainly that read it during 2020, I probably quoted my dad about 82 times or something like that. So I just feel there's certain people that really had a good perspective on what was happening in 2020. And if I said certain things, you'd be like, oh my God, the crazy liberals or whatever. But I mean, when I first started writing my book, my dad was just all, you're not going to make it too liberal, right? So he was not a snowflake by any means, you know. He survived because of a gun, and I'm here because of one. So I definitely get that across in the book, and it's a lot about what it was like growing up in a house with two Holocaust survivors, for better or worse.
Your dad died recently?
Yeah, unfortunately, he was one of the victims of 2020, not COVID, but he passed away at the end of the year.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, my dad died 3 years ago. I'm still, I don't think you ever really get past it, but
no, you probably shouldn't.
It's a great luxury to grieve someone you can respect and love. You know, I really feel a lot of compassion for people who look in the mirror and see their dad and don't like what they see. Yeah. It must be very hard. Anyway, Dave Pell, thank you, dude. I'm really looking forward to reading the book.
Oh, thanks a lot.
I like your style and the way you think, and you put a lot of work into what you do. And I really appreciate that.